Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. There is a story which you can tell with any character and any time period in any place in the world, and it will still function. This is the universal human story, a story so deeply rooted in the human experience that anyone will understand it and resonate with it, provided it is presented skillfully and in accordance with the basic structure of the story. Now, I know that's a very shocking claim to make, but if you think about it, you will realize that A Christmas Carol has been told and retold in just about every fiction franchise existing. Nearly every serialized TV show has spoofed that story. You can find versions of it told through the Flintstones, the Jetsons, the Muppets. Now, this story functions in part because it was written by a man who was a very astute student of human nature. Charles Dickens may be one of the best English language storytellers to have ever lived, right up there with Shakespeare and Jane Austen. It also functions because it deals with themes like loneliness, ambition, and misplaced priorities, which anyone can experience and probably will experience over the course of their life. At the same time, while elements that are specific to the time it was written do exist in the story, things like workhouses or the use of a coal furnace to heat an office, the things that define A Christmas Carol, the miserly Ebenezer Scrooge, the haunting visions of things that you regret in the past or that may happen to you in the future, these things are universal. You can find them in any society, in any place, at any time through human history. And they are so common that most people probably will encounter them at some point in their life. Furthermore, Dickens deals with these issues with such a heartfelt, wholesome approach that promises that yes, even though you have been cruel and disregarded the well-being of other people in pursuit of your own selfish ends which didn't really make you happy, you can still always turn around and come back from the sins you have committed. The ghosts that haunt Ebenezer Scrooge are not avengers. They are not things that bear grudges or wish to punish him for his wrongdoing, but rather they are people who wish to bring about his welfare, to turn him back from the precipice he stands on. Now, this was not the first time Dickens had grappled with these kind of themes. This was not the first time that he had looked at very universal human struggles. You could not be a storyteller as gifted and as enduring as Dickens was if you did not speak to the universal human experience in some way. However, Great Expectations or A Tale of Two Cities, these are stories that are rooted in social problems or historical events that were fairly unique to the England that Charles Dickens lived in. A Christmas Carol is unanchored from those kind of concerns to a large extent, and the aspects of the time period that are mentioned and necessary to the story can very easily be swapped out with some other comparable modern-day equivalent, or some equivalent in whatever time period, in whatever place you wish to tell your version of A Christmas Carol. I think this is why A Christmas Carol is the most enduring and beloved and well-known of Charles Dickens' works, in spite of its specific placement in time and in culture. So if A Christmas Carol is the universal human story, what is the opposite? The opposite is a story that is so specific and so narrowly focused on time, on person, and on message that it becomes very difficult for others to relate to. I have been thinking about this because I have been paying attention to some of the buzz surrounding Pixar's Turning Red. Many people I have heard talk about the movie discuss it as a very niche film. They all agree that it sounds a lot like a story that is so deeply ingrained in the experience of Asian American immigrants to English-speaking countries that the exact family dynamics it portrays can be difficult to relate to. Add on the fact that it is a story about a girl starting to go through puberty and the very uncomfortable realities that puberty can have for anyone, but specifically for girls, and its heavy focus on very specific cultural trends like boy bands or life in the city of Toronto, Canada. And there are suddenly so many very specific details and experiences that not everyone is going to resonate with. And you have a story that is very immediate. It is very focused on a single point in time, to the point where people who have not experienced that point in time will have difficulty fully understanding and investing in the characters they encounter at that point in time, or living under those particular social circumstances. Now, there's nothing wrong with telling a niche story. I don't think it's any better or worse than telling the universal human story. And I'm sure there are at least one or two other equally universal human stories, not just A Christmas Carol. Although they're so broad, I'm sure there can't be that many of them. However, both of these genres of stories have real problems. The problems with the universal human stories, your Joseph Campbell monomyths or your Christmas carols, is that people can become so fixated on them, they stop thinking about what the stories actually say. They begin to see them simply as a formula. And with the heartfelt and very sincere, careful and considered approach to these stories, they become hollow. They become cookie cutter. They become flat and uninteresting. When I turned 13 or 14, I started to notice that I was not seeing as many parodies or spoofs of A Christmas Carol as I was used to seeing when I was younger. I think that's because the Christmas Carol story became so stale. People still like to go and see the original, but they are no longer trying to do new takes on it. I think because they have lost sight of what the story was really trying to say about human nature and the importance of facing our failings and turning away from them towards a better life. Unfortunately, when stories become too familiar to us, we begin to tune out the details, and eventually we tune out entirely. Very immediate, specific stories, on the other hand, can become so foreign to us that we can never tune into them at all. We can't make sense out of the patterns of the story because we have no frame of reference to put them in. And if you can't attract and hold an audience, your story becomes more about your own self-satisfaction than about sharing something with another person. That can very rapidly become a vicious spiral that leads you further and further into more navel-gazing, and I fear that's where we are right now as a society trying to tell stories. Now, one bright spot in all of this is that this change was made relatively quickly. Just about a decade, maybe a decade and a half of storytelling brought us from the very broad universal stories down to these very immediate navel-gazing stories. Hopefully that means we can get back just as quickly, and we'll start to see a renaissance in storytelling, hopefully within my lifetime. But none of this means you should avoid immediate, personal, intimate stories. Even Charles Dickens only wrote A Christmas Carol once, after all. Instead, look at the excesses of these two extremes of storytelling and try to avoid them. Now, I know every author would really love to have a work of fiction that is so well known and celebrated and loved as A Christmas Carol. Dickens certainly created something very special there. But if your goal is to create that every time, you are already falling into the trap of the universal human story. It is the specifics that make the story interesting. And if you hold back on specifics just to try and keep your story universal, you are undercutting your story in an attempt to tell someone else's story, and that is going to hurt your efforts. At the same time, if you cannot find those universal human touchstones for people to grab hold of, well, there's a possibility you will never get your story across in the first place. This is the lesson of Turning Red. So, think about these two extremes, and most of the time, aim to land somewhere in the middle, and I think you'll do pretty well, at least as far as this particular aspect of writing goes. Anyway, that's all I got for you today. Hopefully you enjoyed that. Let me know what your favorite specific and universal stories are in the comments down below, and I will talk to you